Hi, I'm Jay Miller, and on today's episode of George Fox Talks, we'll be talking about 19th century Quaker women. They were tenacious. Today on George Fox Talks, we're in the studio with Robynne Rogers Healey and Carole Dale Spencer. They're the co-editors of a new book from Penn State University Press called Quaker Women, 1800 to 1920 Studies in a Changing Landscape. It's part of Penn State's new History of Quakerism series. Robynne is a professor of history and co-director of the Gender Studies Institute at Trinity Western University. And Carole Dale Spencer is the previous associate professor of Christian spirituality at Earlham School of Religion and an adjunct professor of spiritual formation at Portland Seminary, which is a part of George Fox, and a previous professor at Portland Seminary before heading off to Earlham. So it's wonderful to have you both in the studio today, and really excited to talk about this book. We were talking a little bit on the show about how in some ways Quaker women have been of interest to scholars for some time, but this is also, I think, a time where scholars are revisiting a lot of that interest. So I'm curious if the two of you could talk a little bit in light of the book, how Quaker women have been studied in the past, and then what you're hoping this book contributes to the study of Quaker women.
Well, I think in the past, mostly it was famous elite women that were well-known, like Elizabeth Fry. Hagiographies would be written about her. And a few others, maybe Margaret Fell, Lucretia Mott, you would hear about them. But there's just so many women that people don't know about that did amazing things. And Quaker women's history really didn't begin until like the 60s or 70s with women writing feminist history. And then they discovered this treasure trove of material about Quaker women that was in archives that no one had ever read for 100, 200 years. And it was just like amazing. And so there was a lot written at that time, particularly on the 17th century, and then some on the 18th. Not as much on the 19th, except for the women that were involved in the women's rights movement. A lot of that was written about.
Yeah.
And like Rosemary Radford Ruther, she discovered Quakers and said, "Oh, they were the first feminist movement."
This is a historian.
Yeah, historian.
Women's history historian.
A theologian and a historian, and discovered Quakers and kind of put them on the map at that point.
Yeah, she did. And I think one of the things that, so you raised the point, Carole talked about the fact that the writing of women's history and Quaker women's history was in that as well, really started to happen in the 60s and 70s. And in that context, I think one of the reasons that women the 19th century women who were studied were the women who were involved in the women's rights movement is because those were the questions historians asked in that period. Who were the women who were at the forefront of feminism and at the forefront of women's rights? And so those were the folks that were studied. But there are so many in part, I think, because Quaker women did leave records and Quaker women wrote things, that there is, for those of us who are historians or those of us who do literary studies, anybody who does textual-based studies, finding those sources has provided us with a huge amount or a lot of material that we can actually dig into. But one of the things that was surprising to us as we went into this project was discovering how little had actually been done on 19th century women. So the focus has tended to be on the early Quaker women because I think that they were certainly very radical for their time. And I think this a part of the reason that they have been of interest to scholars, not just those who are Quakers, but those who study Quakers, is because they stand outside the traditional norms of the period. And that tends to be really exciting for scholars to examine. And so the 16th and 17th century, 17th century Quaker women have been studied a lot, but there hasn't been very much done on 19th century Quaker women, except for the big names. And I think we're getting more into the 19th century now, but except for women like Elizabeth Gurney Fry, Lucretia Mott, we aren't getting the stories the same. We haven't.
And
gotten
the
the same
19th century
stories.
definitely focused on these radical Hicksite women and kind of left out the Orthodox women. And they were quite active, and they were for women's rights too, many of them. The woman that I did in my chapter, Hannah Whitall Smith, was a fervent feminist who was all trying to convince Quakers that women should have the right to vote. She had a hard time. Quakers didn't always appreciate that. They didn't support it, for the most part. It was really this minority of women that were trying to get the Quaker movement to get on board here. Well, you believe in equality of all people, so shouldn't women have social and political rights as well? And, they had a lot of opposition.
And as your book shows, they were even working for equality within their meetings.
Oh,
and sort of
exactly,
the way meetings operate, which we can talk about a little bit more. But you brought up Hicksite women and Orthodox women, and I wonder if we might pull back a little bit and talk about Quakerism in the 19th century, especially on the American side is where those terms are relevant, although Orthodoxy is relevant in Britain, or evangelicalism is relevant in Britain. But I kind of also wonder if maybe women haven't been studied in the 19th century as much because there's also the Quaker 19th century is so complicated.
It is complicated.
And you do have to do a lot of toggling back and forth and figure out who's who. So could you just say a little bit? Could you give a quick overview? You do this in the introduction to your book very nicely. But just especially for listeners who may not be familiar with the history, what do you need to know about Quakerism in the 19th century?
Go ahead. Schism, division, turbulence.
It was an incredibly turbulent period because yes, we talk, and I think in the American context, those who are familiar with Quaker studies will be aware of what is known as the Great Separation, which is the Hicksite-Orthodox separation that happened. It started 1820. Well, the separation itself began was in 1827 in the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, then spread to New York Yearly Meeting and other meetings in 1828. But it didn't end there. The Hicksites went on to divide further, as we discuss in our introduction, and the Orthodox went on to divide further, as we discuss in the introduction. So what happens is that by the time we get to the end of the period covered in this book, there's an incredibly fragmented Quakerism. So to talk, and I think you hit on something, Jay. Maybe this is a reason that there hasn't been a lot of discussion of 19th century Quakerism, because scholars look at the 19th century and Quakerism and think, well, which thread am I going to follow through the 19th century, right? And that's really challenging. But you get like a patchwork quilt of Quakerism, or my favorite way to envision it is the tree, a tree, and you get these various branches on the family tree.
Oh, I wish we had a picture of that. Our pastor has it in his office of this tree that has like, a million branches. I mean, all these little...
Which is the story of Protestantism in the U.S. at the same
exactly,
time, right? So this is part of,
not just the
Quakers are not like different from their society, in this sense.
Absolutely. But these divisions opened up spaces where women really stepped into into leadership, into conversation. And I think that's one of the reasons that studying 19th century Quakerism and studying women within that context gives us an opportunity to look at the ways that women did move into leadership in really meaningful ways.
Yeah. So we could really say that the divisions were a positive for Quaker women. I think they were, because it opened up so many more opportunities for them and got them thinking about not only within their own meetings, but within the greater society, what they could do.
Yeah.
So I see it as, a positive, like had a silver lining for women.
Right, a silver lining for painful experiences, because these were really incredibly painful experiences. And I think that for those of us who are people of faith ourselves, and for whom a faith is meaningful when we look at historical actors and we can empathize with the fact that that would have been a really painful time. It wasn't like just saying, well, that's it. I'm not going to be this kind of Quaker anymore. And my family, because these divisions did not just divide meetings. They divided families. They divided communities. And it wasn't like if there was a division that the folks in one who split off, let's say in one schism, all got up and moved away. Some did. But these people had to live together. They had to live in community still with people who were no longer part of their meeting. And it was very painful.
Yeah, that reminds me of a passage in, this is an edited collection, right? So you're the editors and you have chapters in the books, but also chapters by other scholars. And in Thomas Ham's chapter, he talks about, this is a quote from his chapter where he says, "We have numerous examples of women making up their own minds about the schism. In Clinton County, Ohio, Lydia Sabin wrote to her Orthodox family that, quote, offend or please who it might, she must say amen to Elias Hicks's doctrine, according to a letter from Nathan Hunt. For Rachel Hicks on Long Island, the decision came only after real agony of soul. Quote, among all the members of our society, there was not another who was tried as I was." So I love that. Just gives you a real window into people's experiences. A question I have on that is like going back to the original sort of Great Schism in like 1820, 1820,
27,
28. What was the role of women in that schism? One of the things as I was reading your book, reading the different chapters, in that Ham chapter, he seems to indicate that he doesn't think gender was part of the schism. Robyn, in your chapter, you highlight the role of transatlantic women writers, and we'll get into the specific minister you wrote about there. But I'm curious, just big picture, what was the role of women in the schism? Was it significant in terms of thinking about gender, or was it really just a debate about doctrine?
It was mainly a debate about doctrine. I mean, the role of women was pretty established in Quakerism, that women had at least spiritual equality. So that wasn't part of the debate. But I think that the difference of perspective is, were they involved in the theological debates? And they definitely were. You certainly show that in your chapter.
Yeah. And so I think you're right that Tom takes a slightly different approach, and it's one of the things I really appreciated about this being a multi-authored collection is that we were able to bring in voices and not say this is the only position you can take. I think where I would so one of the things I do is gender studies. And so for me, that means reading against the grain and reading into the silences that are in the records.
Right.
And so I think I would say if you were to read the records and say, well, who are the big voices in the on the Hicksite side, there's Priscilla Cadwallader, who was an incredibly important, vibrant voice. But I think Tom would argue, other than her, there weren't women at the forefront of the traveling ministers in the same way that Hicks and some of the men with him, the men who aligned with him, were involved. But I would suggest, if we look at this in a different way, as Carole said, women did participate in these theological discussions because these theological discussions were happening in homes. These theological discussions were happening in meeting. And imagine visiting ministers. And we talk about the English ministers who came, and they were sort of the celebrities who would arrive. But there were many, and reading any of the 19th century Quaker records in this period, you see Hicksite and Orthodox women on both sides of that divide, busy in ministry, in traveling ministry, sometimes locally, right? Just within their monthly meeting or their quarterly meeting. And one of the things that I found I find interesting is that sometimes, a woman would have a leading to go on ministry, and then somebody on the other side, a woman on the other side would have an equal leading to go, right? So I would contend that women were active in the schism. And it certainly affected them deeply. So were they at the forefront of the arguments? Tom would say no. I would say, well, but if we look at the silences, those women were participating in the decisions that eventually resulted in the separation of Quakerism.
And not just the silences, because we have letters. They wrote so much. Quakers were just prolific writers of everything. That's why there's so many records. It's just incredible how much material there is that hasn't even been actually read yet. I mean, I think there's still things to discover.
Yeah, even in just commonplace books, right? Like the things that they would record, and the schools. It was affecting the schism affected schools, and so Quaker students. It was everywhere, right? And I mean, coming up to Thanksgiving here, thinking about the fact that it would be the same as, are we going to have the uncle for dinner who we disagree with?
We're going to have the Republican or the Democrats here.
Those arguments were happening throughout the community, and it wasn't just men participating in those arguments; women were participating in them as well. And theologically, they were taking positions on doctrine.
Yeah, and could you say just a little bit more briefly, so if there was a woman who was kind of wrestling with this and thinking about, do I kind of go Hicksite or do I go Orthodox? What was that? Obviously, there's a lot of complexity even within those different schools. But if you just could give a brief characterization for our listeners, like what did those choices come down to theologically? While also acknowledging it's probably not just a theological choice.
Yeah, sociological too.
Right.
The richer Quakers would tend to be Orthodox, and so they say. Yeah, it's the studies and
urban
rural
divide. I would suggest and have argued this in I think in this book and in other places that 19th century evangelicalism is what becomes a defining feature of Orthodox Quakerism and evangelical Quakerism in the UK. And that in those, so the important factors were the divinity of Christ. Do you believe that Jesus was divine? The
atonement.
The atonement is, and that's right, the necessity of the atonement. And was Scripture divinely inspired? These were the issues that they were arguing about. So for Hicks,
Elias Hicks, who's the minister of the Hicksite from New York.
That's right. Elias Hicks, who really was sort of at the forefront of leading what he believed was a reformation in Quakerism. And he was not gathering followers around. He wasn't saying, like, come be Hicksites with me. That was not his. He was leading this reformation in Quakerism. And what he wanted Quakers to move away from their involvement with the world because Quakers had become involved in social reform movements, and he was concerned that their involvement in social reform movements was exposing them to too much interaction with other non-Quakers who were tainted by evangelicalism. And
what's so interesting about him is, though, he has more like liberal viewpoints theologically, but he was very conservative on social.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can obviously think about it in terms of theology, and that's the way maybe because of where we are in history, Quaker history today, we look back and we're like, oh, these are theological differences. But you can also look at that and think like, there are also like different kind of sensibilities here of evangelicals or like Orthodox Quakers are really innovators. They're almost progressive in a certain sense, and that they want to be involved in social reform, social activities. They don't just want to stick to the old ways that, there's a case to be made that they weren't exactly flourishing. Certainly, enough people found evangelicalism appealing that they didn't kind of stay in the quietest mode of the 18th century or stay with Hicks. Whereas on the Hicksites, really there's almost a traditionalist kind of desire to maintain a set of practices, and maybe even it's a little more practice oriented And I would think they're probably Hicksites who are maybe kind of theologically more orthodox.
Oh,
or
absolutely,
more, but
yeah.
who are, in their terms of their sensibility, really loyal to older Quaker
Yes.
practices and Quaker sort of distinctives.
Yes, the silent meeting was still very important to
Right.
them.
And
yeah,
that waiting
tradition,
spirituality.
the waiting.
Yes.
Even the relationship to scripture, right? So there's, Quakers influenced by evangelicalism are really focused on like intensive Bible study.
Exactly.
Right. That they pick up from the broader evangelical world. Whereas kind of older Quakers know the Bible really well, right? But also really are very much want to be a spiritual experience all the time and are worried about maybe some I'm not rote study of scripture.
Right. You don't study scripture and analyze it. You just read it devotionally and let it speak to you through the Spirit. That's the
Yeah, so
traditional
devotional
Quaker
is a
view.
good way to put it. Yeah. So after the schism, again, these go different directions, but how would you characterize like what it meant to be a Hicksite Quaker woman versus an Orthodox Quaker woman?
Not all that different in many ways, really. And you can read quotes from Orthodox women that you could put in the mouth of Hicksite women. So they weren't all that different in a lot of ways. But there was a vast diversity within women. I mean, some of the women, the Hicksite women, were against women's suffrage, strongly against. Some of the more evangelical women were for it. So, it's really quite diverse. So it's hard to put a label on them. It's hard to put labels that we would use today on these women.
Sure.
The labels don't work. You can't draw straight lines from that time to our time. So the woman I wrote about, Hannah, Whitall Smith, was very evangelical. She was part of the more holiness Quakers. That was another kind of branch that develops. But she was a universalist. She believed everyone was going to be saved. That's not an Orthodox belief. And she called herself a heretic, and she was proud of it. So, I mean, you just can't put her in the same categories that we think of today.
Yeah, and I think that what Tom shows, especially in his chapter, is that after... So there was that schism, that initial decision to divide. But then... on both sides, on both Quaker and Orthodox sides, as Carole has said, you get these differences, and out of those differences then emerged further disagreements as women. Some women were very, very traditional in terms of not wanting to get involved in politics at all. Others really wanted to be involved. So I think that it's difficult to identify an experience to say this would be the experience of Hicksite women. This would be the experience of Orthodox women, because where women lived made a difference. If you lived in an urban center, if you happened to live in on the frontier of Vermont, that was a different experience altogether. So the daily lives of women and what they did was, I think, contextually situated as much as it was theologically driven. That being said, there were these differences in the meetings, and I think what happens is you do get some Hicksites leave. Some Hicksite women left.
Quaker identity became more fluid at this period of time. Women could change their associations.
So for women who, let's say, wanted to get involved in anti-slavery work, and their meetings were saying, no, you cannot be involved in anti-slavery work. And so women, like men who wanted to do this work, individuals were put in a position where they had to make a decision on the basis of what mattered most to them. And certainly through the 19th century, things like slavery becomes a really and one's position on slavery, that became a really defining factor of identity. Because, I mean, there were Quaker meetings that there were Quakers who fought in the American Civil War and meetings. And we think, what?
Right.
How can that be?
It was a significant number. I don't remember
Yeah.
what it was.
Oh,
but I
yeah.
remember
Yeah,
it
a
was
lot.
there.
Yeah.
How can that be?
Yeah.
Mhm.
But and what happened was that meetings decided to overlook that behavior because that was a case where it's, well, do we put the testimony against war up against the testimony against slavery, and which one do I need to focus on more right now?
Have either of you read the graphic novel Discipline?
Yes.
Have you heard of
Yes.
this?
No.
It's exactly about this
Yeah.
kind of thing. It's by Das Shaw, I
Yeah.
believe. So it's a really interesting kind of comic book graphic novel that draws on historical documentation that kind of addresses just this sort of issue and this tension. Could we talk about abolition and slavery a little bit? Because I feel like that's one of the things, in many ways, what this book is trying to do is complicate our kind of understanding or broaden our understanding of Quaker women. What about Quaker women and abolition? I think in the popular imagination, Quakers are remembered as like anti-slavery activists, abolition activists, being on the right side of history,
Yes.
and these kind of things. What's the picture that emerges in the book of how women and Quakers more broadly interacted with issues of slavery and abolition in the 19th century?
Well, that's complicated too. A lot of women did get involved in anti-slavery, but I would say that they were generally the minority. Abolitionism was considered a very radical position, and you had to disobey the laws if you protected slaves and allowed them to stay at your home and hid them and put them on the Underground Railroad. That was breaking laws, and Quakers, were very like, we don't break laws. So it was before the Civil War. It was very radical. You could get disowned for being an abolitionist in some meetings, and some did. Levi Coffin was disowned from his meeting, although he was welcomed back later because after the Civil War, then they were all heroes. Then
When you're
things changed.
disowned, you can't go to meeting for business. You
Right.
can't be involved with like
It's
the
not
life
like
of the
totally
meeting. But you can still
excommunicated.
avoid,
You
you're-
could still
but-
go to meeting, but
Yeah.
you couldn't be in the business meeting.
which
where
maybe
you
is a
made-
plus depending on how you do
Exactly.
that kind
A lot of
stuff.
people probably didn't mind at all. So it wasn't that big a deal, but it did make a statement,
Yeah.
that your meeting did not approve of what you're doing. Yeah.
You essentially become an attender in certain ways.
Exactly.
You're not a part of the
You couldn't
decision-making
make
life of the meeting.
decisions. So, but after the war, that changed because then they saw that we were on the right side of history, and now we were all abolitionists. But racism was still embedded in Quakerism, and we looked at that, particularly the chapter on
Steve
Sojourner
Angel's
Truth.
Mhm.
Yeah, and you can see that. Well, there's a whole book written, friendship, but fit for friendship, but fit for freedom, but not for friendship. Yes, but I think
Vanessa July.
yes, which was like mind blowing to a lot of Quakers to discover that, oh my, we actually were part of these racist systems, and
Essentially, meetings were segregated in terms of
there
where
was
black
special
people
black
could sit and-
sections for them to sit
there's
in.
a bench that you can sit there.
Yeah.
And I think that it is this complicating narrative that we need to that needs to be interrogated, right? We need to interrogate this notion that all Quakers were always pacifists, were always abolitionists, were always on always supported equal rights. They were always on the, quotes, right side of history. And there are problems even with that term, even though we use it, right? The women, like British women, got very involved in anti-slavery work by raising money, right? And I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that in that area as well, because that also is a complicated story. British Quakers made a lot of money from slavery.
Slave trade. They didn't have slaves,
That's
own
right.
slaves, but they were involved in the trading of slaves.
Yeah, that's right. Like there was a lot of, and so I think that I don't want to us to go away and think, oh, it was only American Quakers who had to address this, right? Like that
Right.
British Quakers also were involved in this, but I think that one of the things that Steve Angel's chapter touches on is just how challenging the experience of Quakerism for Black individuals who attended Quaker meeting or
Right.
wanted to become Quakers
Right.
and couldn't, how complicated that was. And this is work that really needs to be developed further. I feel like we only have just we've just started scratching the surface of some of these stories.
Yeah, it's called Studies of a Changing Landscape.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you're trying to put a lot of these women on the map.
Right.
You know, like, so Steve's writing about Sarah Mapps Douglas. He's
Yeah.
also teasing out sort of Sojourner Truth's relationship to kind of Quakerism. And I think that's a useful kind of place to maybe pivot the conversation a little bit, because if we remember 19th century Quaker women, we already brought up Elizabeth Fry, a prison reformer in England, but in our American context, it's often people kind of like the milieu Sojourner Truth moved in. So Amy Kirby Post, Lucretia Mott, people who are involved in abolition or women's suffrage or these kind of things. And that's kind of coming out of the Hicksite tradition. Both of the women you write about in your chapters are from the more broadly Orthodox evangelical side. And you draw out really interesting things about them. So I wonder if you've kind of brought both them up already, but I wonder if we could go a little bit deeper into, like, you know, the women you wrote about and why you found them compelling for thinking about Quaker women in this period. I don't know if either one of you want to, you've brought Whitall Smith, who was a little more like mid-19th century,
Right.
mid to late.
Robson would have been earlier.
Yeah, maybe let's start with Robson. We can kind of work chronologically.
Okay, so Elizabeth Robson was an English minister who traveled in ministry a lot throughout England, and then came to North America as part of, in advance of the separation. So there were a group of English Quaker ministers who came. Anna Braithwaite was another woman, but there were men as well. Elizabeth Robson's brother came, and it was almost as if the London Yearly Meeting said, who are our big players? Let's send them. And they did. So Robson's story is interesting, I think, for a number of reasons. She's interesting because of what she did. I also am fascinated by the records that she left, which are so, and I talk about this in a way that I wouldn't normally discuss in doing historical work, but the way that they are so highly curated by her family before they were donated to the archives. And so that is, it's almost as if this is the narrative we want to leave. And so I would love to be able to dig into her further. But Robson came in 1824. She was in North America for 4 years. She left her family for 4 years. She traveled thousands of miles, visited every meeting. She
Which is amazing, but also not atypical for
No,
it-
lots of women did
ministers
that,
and
yeah.
women
And they
ministers.
started that in the 17th century.
Absolutely. But she is, it's like she grabs on and she holds on. And so one of the things that's fascinating to me, and I originally encountered Elizabeth Robson more than 20 years ago when I was doing work on the Upper Canadian meetings, what is today Ontario. And I found it interesting that she landed in Philadelphia, and the first place she was sent to, or the first place she visited, was she went, up into Upper Canada. And I would love, one of my goals is to be able to do some interdisciplinary work with somebody who does GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and actually map her journeys. I think that would be really fascinating to see, okay, what can we learn from actually looking at those locations? But she digs into this. She was formidable, I think, is how I would describe her. She was formidable. She had strong opinions. She was not afraid to engage powerful men in meetings in those opinions. She also, though, describes some of her personal hurts with, when she attended meeting and I think was not well accepted. But she was supported by a group of women who assisted her along the way. And, thousands of miles in very difficult circumstances and, holding public meetings. It wasn't just this is what I find fascinating is this would have been in what I would call the backwoods of the frontier, some real entertainment for non-Quakers as well, because you get these strong, really strong women speakers who could come and speak extemporaneously for over an hour. And, they would use the courthouse, they would use other denominations, churches, and they would fill them and people would come. And so...
Is this part of the penumbra of the Second Great Awakening in the early It's in the early 19th
absolutely.
century, right?
It's very much a part of it, and certainly that area, northern New York State,
burned over,
that's burned over
Yeah.
district, right? And she goes deep into that and contests those women. So she comes back. She and her husband came with her the second time she returned. And I haven't done as much work on those records, but there is an extensive collection of material in her hand that I think I find it interesting that it has not been used very much. And I think that's in part because she was Orthodox. And I think that had she taken a more, what we today would consider more liberal or progressive position, I think that modern historians would be more sympathetic to her. So
one of your suggestions at the end of that chapter, speaking to these tensions between Hicksite and Orthodox, is that you sort of speculate that perhaps there is a gender dynamic in the schism in that Hicksite men felt flustered by Orthodox British women ministers coming across and trying to secure orthodoxy. I guess I'm just curious how speculative a point, how is that? You frame it in a somewhat speculative way. I'm curious just to push on that a little bit and kind of find out what you think.
Well, I think there is very definitely a sense I get from some of the men's posturing and language that how do you, a woman, come into our house and tell us what to do? And there's this the equation of that activity with the American Revolution, right? And that's why I say there is this paternalistic
the
kind
British
of approach, right?
Yes. Because they couldn't get in during the War of 1812,
exactly.
right? So okay,
So there's this sense of
or a British maternalism too, if you're kind of going with that.
And I think that the Hicksite men did just, we don't want to have stay away. And yet, Robson, she is tenacious. She keeps pushing. So I think that before being more conclusive, I'd want to still read a bit more, but I think it's what I would call informed speculation, and I think that
I'm a literary scholar. I'm all for speculating,
and I think that it can be. I can imagine it, right? I can imagine why individuals would have taken those positions. And I can imagine Hicksite men being upset about these British folks coming in, and especially these women, and trying to tell them their business.
Carole, Hannah Whitall Smith could also be described as tenacious, I
Oh,
believe.
absolutely,
But
yes.
in a later period. Could you tell us what part of the 19th century was she a part of? And then what did you want to write about with her in your chapter?
So she was born in 1932, so she's definitely like a next
Born
generation.
after the schism.
Yeah, after the schism,
1832.
1832, sorry, and died in 1911. So
Okay.
she kind of covers this period, the whole period when all these changes are happening. And she was a Philadelphia Quaker, Orthodox, but her meeting was very influenced by Gurney. So this is another split off of the Orthodox, who are even more evangelical. The Orthodox are still not quite Orthodox as far as, orthodoxy and Christianity as a whole. They're not totally. They're a little bit more like an alternative orthodoxy. But the Gurneyites become more evangelical. That's where I think evangelical, because I don't think you could call the Orthodox actually evangelical in that sense, but definitely the Gurneyites were.
Well, one thing, and I'll just flag if listeners haven't listened to our episode on Joseph John Gurney from season 2,
yes.
you can go back and listen to our conversation about that. But I think sometimes, again, like Gurney sort of becomes this embodiment of like evangelical Quakerism. He's at the fount. He was a very traditional Quaker. He stood up
Still
for
a
all
quietist,
like
yes.
the traditional
Wore
Quaker like
Quaker
practices.
dress, yes.
The different Quaker sacramental theology, all this stuff. And so, yes, I'm just flagging that. I think you're absolutely right that it's not until the late 19th century that the like supercharged Quaker evangelicalism really comes in. Because you have the whole Wilburite thing too,
Yeah,
which
that's
doesn't really
another
pop
branch.
up in here
No,
too much.
we don't
think.
we don't cover the Wilburites.
The Wilburites
no.
always get snubbed.
They do.
Yeah.
They do.
But
Yeah.
anyway,
Beaconites in the UK.
right. Anyway, go on about Smith.
Well, Smith is interesting, and because she grows up in this kind of very conservative but progressive kind of orthodoxy with the Gurneyite influence. And at the time that she was a young woman, there was within Quaker meetings, you kind of had to decide if you were going to be plain or if you were going to be gay. I would use it in a very different way. But whether you would follow the traditional plain dress and plain speech, or whether you would be more worldly, you would be more open to the world. And she had to come to that decision. Some of her friends decided plainness and some not. And she decided plainness wasn't for her. But she was very deeply spiritual. And she is very, I would say, disenchanted with the strictness of Philadelphia yearly meeting. They're very conservative. Even the Hicksites, everyone in Philadelphia is conservative. They're all very wealthy. She was part of the Philadelphia Quaker aristocracy. They had a lot of money. And this is a whole social class issues we don't cover a lot in our book. That needs to be a whole nother volume. Yeah. But she discovers the holiness movement, and it's when she has to go to Millville, New Jersey, and she discovers these working class people who are part of this new revival movement. And she is drawn into that. And she always wanted to be a Quaker minister and preach. And that gave her a lot more opportunity than she had within the Quaker meeting, because she was trying to reform the Quaker meeting and open it up. And they were like, no, we're going to stay with our traditions. And so she left Quakerism for a time. But her identity was always as a Quaker, and she rejoins later. And she also eventually moves to England, so she's part of this back and forth North American Quaker and British Quaker. But very early on, she is drawn into the women's movement. She joined with the Bloomerites. She was like 19. Now, she didn't wear bloomers. Bloomers were like a radical dress reform movement, but she always wore kind of Quaker kind of dress. So she didn't wear it, but she was very much in agreement with the ideals of the bloomer movement.
Spiritual bloomers.
She was a spiritual bloomer. So she was very early on pretty radical. It's not like this happened later. This was way before she wrote her classic book, which most people are aware of who know her, The Christian Secret of a Happy Life. That's how evangelicals know her, by this book, which was probably the most widely read book to be written in the holiness movement, and still read today. For spiritual seekers read it. But she also wrote a lot of other books, including her autobiography, which is actually her best book, but most people aren't as aware of that, where she tells her whole story and how she comes to universalism, which is very early on, even before she wrote Christian Secrets. She was a universalist. It doesn't come out in that book. but she was kind of publicly kind of known for being, a heretic, and she was very proud of it. She writes about that all the time, being proud of being a heretic, and how, she's going to face opposition because all pioneers have to face opposition. So she's an incredible woman, and she's just as much of a radical feminist as Lucretia Mott. But most evangelicals only know her one side of her, and she's misinterpreted. I mean, I've read some books where it says that Hannah Whitall Smith believed in submission to her husband. She did not. She challenged patriarchy in all its forms, and yet that's how she's remembered. So it's so interesting how followers through time will cast their heroes in a certain light, and it's not at all what they were like. If you read her autobiography, she wrote letters constantly. If she had been on social media, oh my gosh, she would have loved it. But she wrote letters like every day. There's volumes of letters. I haven't read them all yet, so I still have some work to do. But she told everybody that she was going to write her autobiography and she's going to put all her heresies in it, which she does. So 3 chapters, she tells about how she comes to her position of universalism, which she thinks is biblically based. She was a believer in authority and inspiration of Scripture, but she took a spiritual kind of interpretation, which is my chapter. I write about that. So she puts her whole story in there. And in the very first publication, it's all there. But later, that's all deleted out. And no one knows that, they're missing like a whole segment of her life because it's edited out of her book. So what's also interesting about her is that she becomes more and more, I would say, progressive as time goes on. She was eventually attracted to the socialist movement. And that's a whole nother area. We don't touch on that in this book either, but a lot of Quakers were actually drawn into Christian socialism. A lot of even evangelicals. Late 19th century.
Because you talk about Chartism, which there's
Chartism.
not in Britain, which doesn't get quite the same Quaker
but in America,
participation.
even the women's temperance movement, Frances Willard was also very interested in socialism. I don't think that she joined the party, but she became basically a Christian socialist. And so does Hannah, and I have to explore more of this part of her life. She starts giving labor union speeches. More of the social gospel is kind of where she ends up.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So her whole evolution of her path, her spiritual path, is very fascinating to read. And I can really relate to that. I think a lot of contemporary women can relate to her life. Unlike Robson, you did particularly I really liked Hannah. And she was a strong woman. She had a great sense of humor. She had a lot of tragedy in her life, but she was always transcended that, and she was always upbeat and positive. So there's a lot to like about her.
Yeah. Well, that brings, in terms of whether we like or dislike our historical subjects, is a good segue into a question I wanted to ask. Your chapters in this book, they're doing a lot of things like complicating our understanding of a figure, finding hidden dimensions, or retrieving someone who just hasn't been appreciated at all for various kind of reasons. And I sense that this book is a part of a much bigger trend in the study of Quakerism that's kind of about reevaluation, reevaluating certain sort of Quaker myths, certain stereotypes, or even just certain kind of focuses that we've had for studying Quakers. And I'm wondering kind of how you thought about some of those tensions between, I think to go back to the opening question of that initial interest in Quaker women because of the interest in kind of social activism in the 1960s. So they're initially kind of studied because they're admired. And now we're both aware of the shortcomings of not just Quaker women, but Quakers sort of writ large. We've talked about that with race in the 19th century in some ways. I'm curious. So I sense a tension in a field or studies that kind of have hagiographic or even just hagiographic origins, or even just origins where there's admiration for this historical subject, to a field now where there's that relationship's not the same, and there's a desire maybe to complicate or look at kind of hidden angles. How do you think about that tension in the book and for yourselves as scholars when you're studying people like Robson or Smith?
Well, for me as a scholar, I think that for us as we approached this book and worked with the authors, we wanted to complicate the narrative and complicate stories, but that there wasn't an agenda of saying, well, we have to make sure we say all of the bad things as well as the good things. There was none of that. It was just we need to understand these individuals as fully human individuals. One of the things I've noticed, especially, I would say, I've noticed this in my teaching, and it has affected the way I've approached my own scholarship. In my teaching, I've noticed with my students, probably in the last decade, but very definitely within the last 5, 6, 7 years or so, this need to want to see heroic figures as entirely heroic and villainous figures as entirely villainous. And so I've worked with students to try to help them to understand that all humans are complicated figures. Good people do bad things, things that we would qualify as bad. People that we think of as bad people do good things. And I think that's what, in order for us to tell the whole story, a story that provides a deeper understanding of Quakerism in the 19th century, I think we need to allow the, quotes, bad stuff to sit right along the good stuff. So it can't just be these triumphant narratives. There has to be a sense of people did things that we today would maybe find difficult to deal with. I don't think anybody wants, there are no Quakers today who would say, yes, let's segregate Black people in, on their own bench or section of that. I'm like, nobody. And we wish that wasn't part of the history, but it is part of the history.
Right.
Yeah, I think
that has a legacy for today.
Exactly.
Still,
And so then we
say
need
segregate the meeting house. Yeah.
But that was so much a part of the culture that, Quakers accommodated the culture just as every other tradition did. And they had to do that to survive in some sense. And so very few people were able to kind of transcend their culture, but we have a few people like John Woolman who seemed to be able to do that and could see beyond, from this like God's eye view of culture. But very few people can do that. And we have to think of ourselves today, what are our blind spots? We're looking at post-colonialism, imperialism, and racism and how it's all, embedded in everything. But what are we missing? There's probably something that down the road, Quaker historians are going to say, well, this new Quaker series of history, we need to write 8 more volumes because they've missed this piece.
They really got
Healey
that wrong.
and Spencer were off the rails.
They got it wrong. Quakerism and all traditions are going to be revisited and reinterpreted all the time.
And
it's just going to happen. That's a good thing.
That is because I have always approached all of my scholarship as part of a conversation that is ongoing. It's not I contribute to what I see as an ongoing dialogue or conversation. It's not that here is the end of the conversation. It's just this is part of an ongoing dialogue.
Yeah, that's great. That's very inspiring. I enjoyed reading the book, and I think that's a great place to end. So thank you so much for your work on this book and all the great contributors that contributed as well. If you're interested in reading the book, there's a special discount code that you can find in the description to this episode in the show notes for 40% off through Penn State Press. So please check that out if you're interested. And thank you once again, Robyn and Carole, for coming on today.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Yes, this has been enjoyable. Yeah. Yes, very fun.
This video podcast is a production of George Fox Digital. To find more material like this, you can subscribe to George Fox Talks on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Our team really appreciates your feedback in the form of likes, comments, and reviews, and we'd really love to hear what you think. To sign up for our weekly email list and to keep up to date with the latest episodes and publications, you can check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.